on the issue of Marquette University Law School, Eckstein Hall. We're glad to have you with us today. We're beginning our fall semester of events, and we're delighted that you could be with us. Today we're talking about the results of the latest Marquette University Law School Poll. Joining us to break down the results is the poll director, Charler Franklin. So please give Charles a warm welcome to the He does have an office here, though, so I guess we don't have to welcome him. He's part of the scenery.
I'm a visitor from the second floor.
That's right. We're going to walk through quite a few results today, dealing with the presidential contest, U.S. Senate race, some issue-related questions that we've developed. And Charles, let's start things off as we always do. We'll talk about when we were in the field, the number of people we talked to, whether these were live interviews, whether we talked to people on landlines and cell phones, all of that.
So we were in the field last Thursday through Sunday, the 25th through the 28th. The sample size is 803 registered voters this month, 650 likely voters. That gives a margin of error of plus or minus 4.5 for the registered voters and plus or minus 5 for the likely voters. We interviewed with live interviewers, half of the respondents by cell phone and half by landline, which is again our usual practice.
And let's begin by talking about the composition of the sample, because this moves around a little bit from survey to survey, and people always want to know, who did we talk to?
And so here is the result. When we include leaners, independents who lean to a party, in this sample it's 45 Republican, 46 Democrat. You can see that over the long haul it's 42-48. So this is definitely tighter with leaners than our usual sample is. When we leave leaners out and just look at people who consider themselves purely partisan, then the sample is pretty close to what it usually is. It's 27-30 with 38 independent. This 27-31 is the long term. So we saw this happen last month as well, that with leaners, we're getting a tighter partisan margin. But in the base partisans, we're looking pretty much like we always do. So what this is showing is that leaners are tilting a little bit more Republican in this sample, and that is driving the first chart, the balance, including leaners, to be quite close. So some of the shifts that we're going to see in the results today are coming from that, though if we look at this over time, here it is with leaners, and you can see that it tightened a bit in the first August survey and then tightened again this time, compared to where we were in July and June with our more normal 7 or 8 point margin when leaners are included. If you look at it without leaners, though, you see that the blue and the red lines continue to move in parallel, reflecting the fact that that margin has stayed pretty stable, just fluctuating by a point or two. But one difference is last month we had an unusually small number of people who call themselves independents, and that's bounced back up to more or less where it usually is. So again, the fluctuation that's taking place is coming in those who call themselves independents and those who lean to one party or lean to the other.
We're going to begin by taking a look at the presidential race. We'll first look at this in a head-to-head matchup between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Before we do that, Charles, a quick word on the fact that we're going to look at registered voters first, and then we'll look at likely voters.
Yep.
Why is it important to be looking at both distinctions?
Excuse me, and yes, I do have my annual cold already, so I apologize for coughing fits and other things. And you in the front row are going to be diseased. Too bad. So registered voters is our basic sample. This is everyone who's either already registered to vote or says for sure they will register by election day. That's our most stable measure of the voting population of the state. Sorry. Likely voters are those who say they're absolutely certain they will vote in November. And for them, That number can fluctuate quite a bit, and we'll see more about how it fluctuates. But this is an old story for those of you who've heard me say it 50 times. And we get more fluctuation in the likely voters, that'll settle down as we get close to Election Day. Right now, we're kind of in between. I don't think it's quite settled down, but it probably will soon.
Take a gulp of coffee or a swig of water here, and we'll mention that.
You should have brought the whiskey.
You can arrange that. We're going to look at the numbers for a head-to-head matchup, but what we want to do is provide some perspective. So let's look at what we've seen in the most recent poll that we've done, Charles. So
Yes.
We'll go back to July, early August, and then this new.
Yeah, not to be too repetitive, but I think you'll see quickly that this is a useful comparison across 3 months instead of the usual 2. So in July, for the head-to-head with registered voters, Clinton was at 43 and Trump 37, a 6-point margin. Then early this month, that expanded to a 10-point margin, 46-36. This month, it has come back down to 42-37, a 5-point Clinton margin. So when we were in the field in July was before the conventions. Then in early August, we were post-convention, and also after the first week post-convention, which was, by all accounts, a bad week for Donald Trump's campaign. So I said at the time, this was the confluence of a good Democratic convention and a bad week for Trump. We saw a big convention bounce and boost for the Clinton numbers. But what's striking is now, we seem to be back pretty close to where we were in July, pre-convention. It was a 6-point margin for Clinton then, it's a 5-point now. Those two line up pretty well.
What about likely voters, Charles?
You'll see the similar pattern, and then I won't belabor this too much as we go forward. In July, for likely voters, it was Clinton by 4. Then that bumped up to a 15-point likely voter lead last time. Remember those volatile likely voters? They expand this margin. But now this time, it's down to just 3, 45-42. So again, it has completely contracted. It was 4 in July, it was 3 now with likelies. It was 6 in July, it's 5 now with registered. So we've seen pretty much all of the shift that took place after the convention disappear and come back to where we were beforehand.
Let's make this a 4-way presidential contest. We'll have the Libertarian Gary Johnson and the Green Party candidate Dr. Jill Stein to this mix.
So here I'm just going to start with early August. You can see that it was a 4-point margin, sorry, I can't read that, 9-point margin for Clinton and Trump with Johnson at 10 and Stein at 4. This time it's a 5-point margin, 37-32. 11 and Stein up just a little bit at 7 points. It's still worth noting that we've got 13 points, still not satisfied with any of these choices. I would stress this, if we have 18 here plus 13 here, that is a huge percentage of the electorate that's still reluctant to pick one of the major party candidates. Conventional wisdom says that these third-party votes will decline as we get close to the election because historically that's typically what's happened to third-party support. But this is a hard year to handicap on that because both of the leading major party candidates have such high disapproval numbers or unfavorable numbers that do we really have confidence that that's going to happen? But if you put the third party plus the undecided, or just look at the undecided in the previous charts, the two-party matchups, you come away recognizing what a large percentage, now I think it's 19% of unregistered voters, don't take a position in the head-to-head, and it's even bigger when you add in the four-party candidates. So I think for this reason we might expect to see more fluctuation going forward than we usually do as this large percentage of reluctant voters eventually make up their mind, maybe to stay with the third party, maybe to come home to their party, maybe to stay home. altogether.
Is there much difference between the registered voter results and the likely voter results?
There's not very much. If we go to likely voters, it's you can see it was a 13-point Clinton lead here, but it was 9-3, and now it's 10-4 for Johnson and Stein. With again the race closing here, one interesting feature, I guess, is that the margin between Clinton and Trump is essentially the same, whether we're doing the two-way head-to-head or the four-way. So it's not shifting the balance of who's ahead hardly at all when we explicitly include the third-party candidate.
Let's look at the rematch shaping up in the U.S. Senate race. Ron Johnson, Russ Feingold. This time Ron Johnson is the incumbent in this race. Let's go back and sort of do the same thing here, Charles. Begin with registered voters and look at our last three polls, and then we'll move to likely voters in our last three.
So in July, it was Feingold at 48, Johnson at 41. This is registered, 7-point margin. Last month, that became a 6-point, 49, 49-43. And this month, it's even tighter, 46-42, a 4-point margin. So if you go through those 7 points, then 6 points, now 4 points among this more stable registered voter sample. If we look at it for likely voters, in July it was a 5-point margin. Then it became an 11-point margin in that big surge in early August. But now it falls back to a 3-point margin, 48-45, with likelies this month. So whether it's a 4-point registered or a 3-point likely, the conclusion is the same, a fairly close race. And I should say, inside the margin of error, I told you earlier, our margin of error for registered is 4.5, and for likely is 5.
There is a libertarian candidate in this race. His name is Phil Anderson. He's a Madison area businessman. We add him to the mix. What changes, if anything?
Well, as we see with the other third-party candidates for president, he does surprisingly well, 8%. Well, more than libertarian candidates have gotten in past races here, where they've averaged less than 1% of the vote. This again raises the question of, is this support that will actually show up on election day, or whether it will wither away. But as we saw before in this month, it's Anderson at 7 early in the month, and Anderson at 8 now. So his support has remained basically the same, and as with the presidential race, adding him in doesn't change the Senate margin very much. A little bit, but it's 4-3 for for registered and likely this month, whether, meaning this sample. Sorry, it's confusing to have two August polls. 4 and 3, whether you look at it in the two-party head-to-head, or 4 and 3 if you look at it with the three-candidate race. So doesn't seem to affect the race much.
Okay, and that's both likely and registered. Okay.
I'm sorry, that, I beg your pardon, I got off. Sorry. I obviously lost my place there. In any case, 6 point. I was talking about Johnson and I got Anderson and I got a little confused. I'm sorry. Here we go, quickly. So in July with registered, he was at 8, then at 7 in the early month, and at 8 now. And with likelies, 7 and 6. So not much of a trend in his support.
Let's see who's going to the polls, Charles. When we ask people, are you likely to vote? Republicans, Democrats, Independents, who's likely to go to the polls?
Yeah, and this is that issue of the fluctuation in the commitment to vote, which even less than partisanship is something that's prone to flopping around, switching around. And here it is for the two parties, on the left, the Republicans, on the right, the Democrats. And you can see how much that has almost oscillated for Republicans from an 89 to 79, and back up to 86, down to 79, up to 84. It's just fluctuating, maybe meaninglessly, maybe meaningfully, but in terms of the sample, it certainly shows that in this month's sample, we have a little more Republican likely voters than we had last month. For the Democrats, it's been more of a steady, very small drop-off each month, where each of the individual changes are tiny, but cumulatively we've gone from 88 to 81, so there's been a little bit of a shift there. Now again, we're still in August, so there's plenty of time for people to get motivated, for both parties to crank up the get out the vote game and so on. But when you're talking about, well, why is there a difference between early August and now? Well, part of it is a 79 versus 82 turnout rate early in the month versus an 84-81 turnout rate this time. That's not all of the game, but it's one element that pushes to a better outlook for Republicans this sample.
We're going to look at favorable ratings for the presidential candidates. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of them? I think the truism in this part of the discussion is that unfavorable is a lot bigger factor here than favorable for both of these candidates.
And there's a lot of unfavorable to go around.
Yeah, there is. Let's start with Donald Trump and start with the first poll we did in August and then this one.
Okay. So his unfavorable is at 65 in the early August, 27 favorable. This time, hardly changed, 20, I can't read it. 28. So you can read it. I should just let you read it. 63. So hardly any change in Trump's favorability over these two samples. Okay, if we look at Hillary Clinton, 43-53. And now 35-58. So there's been a bit of movement there for Clinton, which has been down when Trump has been pretty much stable. Now, if we went back to July, we'd see that July she looked a little closer to where she looks now than she did in early August. Again, evidence that the effect of the convention boosted her favorable ratings and slightly decreased her unfavorables. But now that effect is gone, and she's back to about where she was before the convention.
I was just going to say, we were talking about this before we came in the room today, and some of what we see in these numbers are mirrored by some other polls. There's a national poll out today, it's ABC News and the Washington Post, and again it shows Clinton's negatives increasing in the last couple of weeks, and you know, we can all speculate about whether it's stories about the foundation or emails or whatever, but you see similar trends even on a national basis.
You certainly do, and I would commend paying attention to those national trends as well. But, once or twice a week I post to my Twitter stream the update of the Gallup daily favorability ratings for Clinton and Trump, both among the public as a whole and among Democrats and among Republicans within their party. And while Clinton got a big boost coming out of the conventions in that measure, and Trump suffered a good bit of a fall off right after the conventions, in the time since they had initially leveled out. But in the last couple of weeks, Clinton's numbers have come down a bit, so that today, and I think this is in the Washington Post story and their data as well, the two are now about equal in unfavorable and favorable ratings, where she had a pretty decent advantage in that a few weeks ago. So despite the fact that these folks are very visible, almost everybody has an opinion about them, it's interesting and maybe a little surprising that we're still seeing some real fluctuations in their relative standing. And that, you know, we could be in for more of a ride if those things shift more as we go forward.
We did ask about Gary Johnson because, as you all know, he's trying to get into the debates. He's to get 15% of the vote in some major polling shortly before the debates. He's going to be in Wisconsin. He's going to be in Milwaukee tomorrow to serve poll, I believe. How did he do? Do people have any idea who Gary Johnson is?
Not a whole lot. Early August it was 13, 15, and 72 hadn't heard enough. This time it's unchanged, really, 14, 14, and again 72 haven't heard enough. So not a lot of movement there, and a fairly even balance in favorable and unfavorable.
switch to
I'm sure he would point out more even balanced than the other two.
more numbers and favorable ratings for Ron Johnson and Russ Feingold. Let's begin with Ron Johnson.
So here's Johnson, early in the month, 34, 32, and then still persistent 33, haven't heard enough. In this month, it's barely changed, 32, 34, with 32 not heard enough. So not much of a shift in his ratings. For Feingold at the beginning of the month, 44, 36, with 20 not heard enough. But this month down a little bit, 40 favorable, 35 unfavorable, and a slight uptick, 25 not giving an opinion. So not a lot of movement, but as we see in other parts of the poll, a little more movement away from the Democrat, whereas both Republicans at the presidential and at the Senate level fairly stable. So there seems to be more of a move against Democrats.
The Libertarian candidate, Charles?
So Phil Anderson is 92% don't have an opinion. Early in the month, 4 and 5, favorable and unfavorable. This month it's 4 and 4, and still 92% don't have an opinion.
We asked another question about the U.S. Senate race, and this is what we have typically called the empathy question. This is whether or not people feel a candidate cares about people like them. Does a candidate care about people like me? So we're going to begin with the numbers for the Senate race. Ron Johnson and Russ Feingold. Do they care about them?
Yes. This is the first time we've asked this question about the Senate candidates. We asked it throughout, or through most, of the 2012 Senate race, and found that it played a fairly big role in that election. It's something that's routinely asked at the presidential level. So this is the first step into assessing something other than just favorable and unfavorable about the Senate candidates, and instead beginning to ask what are the elements that people see. And we'll have more as we go forward, but for now, does CARES describe Russ Feingold? 46% say it does, 36% say it does not. And for Ron Johnson, 38% say CARES describes him, 38 says does not. So you get an element there of the differential sense of this empathy factor, if you will, that's advantaging Feingold at this point and is an even split on Senator Johnson.
We'll go back to the presidential contest. We ask a few candidate trait questions, I guess you could call them, Charles. Honesty. Does that describe Hillary Clinton? Does it describe Donald Trump?
So early in the month, 32 said it described Clinton, 33 said it described Trump. They were even, and it does not describe. But in this poll, she has fallen off a fair bit, whereas he's remained about the same. So this is the first time we've really looked at this. You saw it a moment ago in favorability that her favorables have fallen off some. You're going to see it here, and you'll see it in some other traits as well. But honesty has clearly been, of the 3 or 4 traits that we've consistently measured on the presidential level, this is really her weakest point. And she had risen from July to early August to match Trump on this, though match at a pretty low level. But now that too, that gain has fallen off and is surely affecting her vote.
How about the empathy question for both of the candidates?
Here both score a little better, but she was at 47 CARES to Trump's 31. But this month that's fallen off a little bit to Trump still at 31. So again, running ahead of Trump here rather than behind, but that margin has now shrunk over the last 3 weeks.
Does Hillary Clinton have the qualifications to be president? Does Donald Trump have?
Her strongest point, early in the month, 58% said she did, 29% said Trump did. Now it's down a little bit, 54 and Trump up to 32. So again, a little bit of a shift. So across these 3, you've seen in each case, she looks a little weaker on each of the measures. He looks about the same or just a tiny shade stronger on this one.
We started asking a question about how comfortable you are with the possibility that either one of these candidates would be president.
Here we combine very comfortable or somewhat comfortable, very or somewhat uncomfortable, and then I break out the very uncomfortable just by itself. Early in the month, 43 were comfortable with Clinton, 55 uncomfortable with 41 very uncomfortable, 31, 68, and 53. That's 41 and up to 32 here, and 45 and 52 here. So still a bit of an advantage for Clinton, but again, a little tightening of the margin on that.
Charles, we want to look at the head-to-head presidential vote, Clinton, Trump, and look at how that's shaking out in terms of party. And I guess, we'll talk about whether people are excited to vote for these candidates.
If you think about the things that we're watching change, one is turnout. That's that likely voter number and which party's more energized. One's the balance of the parties in the sample. Where do the leaners lean, Democrat or Republican? Another is party loyalty. What percentage of the party is voting for their nominees, their party's nominee? And when we look early in the month, Clinton had quite an advantage, getting 90% of the Democratic advantage, while Trump was getting about 79% of the Republican, and independents were splitting relatively evenly between the two parties, and uncertainly either don't know won't vote. This time, Clinton has dropped from 90 to 89, hardly any change, and Trump is slightly up, 79 to 81. So these are way inside the margin of error, but a slight movement of a little less Democratic loyalty, a little more Republican loyalty. Clinton actually has picked up slightly among the independents and a little tiny drop-off of the undecided among independents. But this is still a big number of undecideds still out here.
What do we see in the U.S. Senate race, Charles?
In the Senate race, Feingold had a bit of an advantage early in the month, 92 to 87 in party loyalty. But this time, it's actually dropped a bit, 88 to 87. So that is part of what's going on in accounting for why do we see this drop-off in Feingold's margin, especially maybe among likely voters. Whether that reflects something that's enduring or just a short-term blip, we'll have to wait to see. But but both of those showing a little bit of tightening in party loyalty.
Immigration has been a big issue in this presidential contest. What do we do about undocumented immigrants in this country? As many as 11 million people, potentially. We presented in a number of our polls 3 options for voters. Which one would you favor? And let's look at where we are with the new poll and put a little historical perspective on this, Charles.
This is a question we've been asking since 2012, so one of the nice things is we can look at it in comparison to earlier times. It's also worded the same way that several national pollsters, including the Pew Center, words it, so we can look at it compared to national data as well. And it offers 3 options. One is that undocumented immigrants in the country can stay and eventually apply for citizenship. The second option is they can stay in the country, but only as temporary guest workers. And the third option is they must leave their jobs and leave the U.S. Okay? So I will summarize by those. When we look at this month's poll here, 62% would choose what, for shorthand, I'll call the citizen path. 19% of guest worker, only 15% would require undocumented immigrants to leave the country. Is that a striking number or not? Well, it is sort of. If we go back to 2012, and here I'm using all 4 samples during the fall, not gigantic changes, but a change of down about 4 points on leave, up about 8 points on a path to citizenship. This is a kind of evolutionary change in opinion that we often see in political issues over time. They don't dramatically change overnight, but a little bit. This also matches up well with national data, where almost all national polling over the last several years has shown something over 50% favoring a path to citizenship, but that number has been in the mid to upper 50s in most national polling. So we're fairly similar to the national results. But the change between 2012 and now here in the state, and I should say all of this is with registered voters, so it's the stable group of registered voters, shows quite a change in position. Or I shouldn't say quite a change, a evolution in that.
Let's talk about this issue according to political party. How do Republicans feel about this? How do Democrats feel about it?
This has obviously been an issue in this year's presidential campaign. Republicans, 43% favor path to citizenship, 25% a guest worker program, and 28% requiring undocumented immigrants to leave. It's vastly different among Democrats. 81 favor path to citizenship, 13, and just 4 removal from the country. But among independents, there's a pretty substantial support for citizenship path, and 17 guest worker, and 15. I think what's striking, given the positions of the presidential candidates, is, relatively speaking, how large the support for a path to citizenship is among Republicans. The support for being required to leave the country is a good deal higher than it is in the population as a whole. But it's still not the largest category within the party.
How do Trump and Clinton voters feel about this?
Well, among Clinton voters, very high support for path to citizenship, very little for deportation. But even among Trump voters, not just Republicans, but people voting for Trump, only 31% favor deportation, 38% would favor a citizenship path, and 29% some sort of guest worker program.
And what do people perceive the candidates' positions to be on this issue?
Well, they see some differences. If we look at Trump, the perception of Trump is that 68% say he favors deportation, 14% a guest worker, and just whatever that number is, 9% favor path to citizenship, and it's virtually the reverse for Clinton, 70% path to citizenship, 15 and just 2.
So we asked people whether or not they thought the candidates had changed their policy proposals on immigration. And this seems especially fitting. I mean, right now Donald Trump is on his way to Mexico to meet with the Mexican president, Peña Nieto. And there are some questions about how he's got a big speech tonight too, so I guess we'll find out more about it in Phoenix. So we have some things going on, but we're wondering, do people perceive these candidates as changing their positions?
So, was fortunate that this story started to develop in time to be able to add these questions to the survey. And it's fortunate that it continued through the week instead of veering to some other issue. But I think what you've seen here is important. Let me just sort of editorialize for a second. That the notion that immigration policy preferences are as starkly different between the candidates as their perceived positions clearly is not true. We saw that in the previous slides. So now what about changing of positions? And here, 47% say that Trump has recently changed his position. 39% say he has not. So that perception that there was some shifting going on clearly percolated to almost half of the voters in just this week or so that this issue has been bobbling around. Whereas most people don't see any change in Clinton's position. As far as I know, she hasn't said anything in the last couple of weeks to suggest that she's changing her position.
What about Trump voters?
So change is perceived. Excuse me, Trump voters are actually just as likely to perceive a change as the public at large. It's 49% of Trump voters see a change and 37% don't see a change. So Trump voters and the public at large are equally likely to perceive him as shifting his position. But among those who think there's been no change, this is only for Trump voters. Those who think he hasn't changed, 72% think he still wants to deport. But among those who perceive a change, half as many, just 36%, think that's still his position. So there's been a really dramatic shift. If you're a Trump voter and you think he's shifted, this has really moved off in this direction to the left. But if you say, no, he's always had this position, it's not that you're misperceiving where he is. It's not that these folks are scattered all over the place. Instead, they're quite certain that he's for deportation and he hasn't changed. And so the perception is pretty steady. And we'll see over time, does the perception of change continue to build from that 49-37? Does the percent not seeing change start to really go down?
There's been a fair amount of discussion about economic angst in this country in this election cycle. And I think we tried to get at that with a few of the questions we asked. We asked questions about people's personal financial situation. Let's begin there, Charles.
Sure. So the question we ask is, how's your family's financial situation? Are you living comfortably, just getting by, or struggling? Living comfortably, 53%. Just getting by, 33%, and 13% say that their family is struggling. This is about where we've seen it earlier in the year when we asked it as well. There hasn't been any abrupt shift in this perception. But when we look at how people vote, especially in light of the discussion of Trump's appeal to the financially struggling, or I would say that's more in the just getting by category. I'm going to put these two together because struggling at just 13% is too small to really break out. So we're going to put those together. Look at the vote by that. Trump actually does best among those who say they're comfortable, leading by 5 points. But among those who say they're just getting by or struggling, Clinton actually has a 16-point margin. Okay? So that's one thing. Now, there are racial differences in support and there are racial differences in income. So I break this out looking only at non-Hispanic whites for comparison to remove any racial effect. But we see the same thing. Among those whites who are comfortable, Trump gets 45 to Clinton's 35. Among whites who say they're just getting by or struggling, Clinton leads by 3 points. So again, we've seen something that some analysis has begun to point out in the national press recently, that this issue has been framed of Trump supporters being financially troubled, predominantly white voters. But when you look at the evidence, it's not very strong that Trump actually is getting most of his support from those folks. The support in a massive Gallup analysis of over 80,000 voters found that he's actually in the middle to upper income categories that he's doing better.
And we'll look at income now.
And so if we do that, so now this is back to everybody. So if we just look at lowest income, under 40,000, these are roughly 1/3 breaks of the income in the state for family income. Not quite perfect, but the best I can do it with the categories that we ask for income. So Clinton leads 54 to 26 among those in the bottom third of income. It's a slight 1-point Trump advantage for the middle income category, and it's a 14-point Trump advantage in the top end of income. Okay? For the same reason as before, let's break it out for non-Hispanic whites separately, and we get the same pattern. Clinton leads by 12 among the lowest income whites. Trump leads by 10 among middle income, and leads by 15 among the high income category. So there's a part of that Gallup story was that it's about the places you live and whether those places are undergoing loss of factory jobs and things like that. And it gives a lot of emphasis not to your personal circumstances, but to the environment in which you live, the geography in which you live. I'm not speaking to that because we aren't looking at that particular issue, but it is pretty clear that a simple story that's based only on financial situation has to explain why we nevertheless see Trump consistently doing better with higher incomes and Clinton consistently doing better with lower incomes, whether that's measured by income, as here, or whether it's measured by the subjective sense of whether you're struggling or not.
Charles, are people optimistic or pessimistic about the future and what the future holds for younger folks?
This is another version of this story about what does the future look like. Well, we are really sadly pretty pessimistic about this. The question is, do you think the current generation, the next generation of Americans, will have a life that's better or worse or about the same than what we have today? So this level of 49% seeing the future as worse is a pretty striking number, and one that deserves a lot of attention regardless of the politics of it. And sort of what's the nature of this level of pessimism? 20% say better and 25% say about the same. So if we combine those two, about 45 say about the same or better, 49% say worse, but still it's hardly morning in America with a lot of enthusiasm and optimism about the future. This is something that I heard people on the Republican side mention after the conventions, about the Republican convention emphasizing themes of bad future, bad times, Democrats being more optimistic, and at least some of the Republican commentators were saying, isn't that a reversal of the Ronald Reagan era of morning in America and good times? But it clearly shows that this is tapping into something that voters are feeling about the future and they're worried about.
And you can see that when you look at Trump supporters and Clinton supporters.
So when we look at how these folks vote, for those who think it's going to be better, Clinton wins by a huge margin. But for those who think it's going to be worse, Trump leads by a big margin, 19 points. For the about the same, Clinton's doing pretty well. So again, how do we put this together? Well, this is about half of voters, and Trump's doing well. This one plus this one are 45% of voters, and Clinton's doing well. The result is the fairly close race that we see overall. But it certainly shows that right now, at least, Trump's appeal is especially strong among the pessimists of the world, and Clinton's appeal is among the optimists and the status quoists.
In light of the recent unrest in Milwaukee, we asked a few questions, about 4 of them, that are related, I guess you could say, Charles, to what happened here and toward attitudes about police and community.
Sure. First, we asked if people had read or heard much about the recent civil unrest in Milwaukee. And this is statewide, of course. And indeed, more than half, 51%, said they had read or heard a lot. 29% said some, and only 19% said only a little or nothing at all. So this was a story that percolated pretty widely through the state, was at least recognized to some extent by about 80% of the state. We then asked, what are your feelings about police in your community? Does being around the police make you feel mostly safe, or does it make you feel mostly anxious? And a very large majority, 86%, said the police made them feel safe, 12% feel anxious. Now, I gotta warn you, when we break this down by race, in any single sample, we do not have a big enough sample of African Americans or Hispanics alone to give a reliable estimate. They're properly represented as a proportion of the electorate, but it's a small percentage. So there's less than 100 African Americans and less than 100 Hispanics. We almost never report a number that's based on a sample size that low. So I combined African Americans and Hispanics as a single group, which puts us just a little over 100 cases for the non-white sample to make this comparison. But I do want you to be aware that that's a relatively small sample size, and it's a combination of 2 different minority groups. But when we do break it down by race, you see this very substantial difference. Among whites, 90% are comfortable and only 9% are anxious. Among African Americans or Hispanics, it's 57 comfortable, 37 anxious. it's surely not news to know that we have widely varying perceptions of the police and interactions with police. So this is hardly headline news, but it does illustrate what a gap we have in these perceptions and why this is an important policy issue that will be with us for a while when folks have such different perceptions.
Charles, we also asked a question about the cause of the unrest and gave people a couple of options. Was the unrest mostly due to decades of disadvantage in black communities, or was it due to a lack of respect for law and order? Two very different takes on the same situation.
The way those are often framed, and 37% said long-term disadvantage, 48% said lack of respect for law and order. Here, I should say I'm not going to show you the breakout by race, because African American perceptions in this tiny sample are quite different from Hispanic perceptions, okay? With actually African Americans being more likely to say lack of respect and Hispanics more likely to say long-term disadvantage. So because those two answers are so different between the two groups, even with this super tiny sample size, I didn't feel it was appropriate to combine them, whereas in the previous slide, they were quite similar in their perception, so I did combine them. So I just want you to understand why I'm not breaking it out that way. I don't think we can reliably estimate it, but from the tiny bit of data we have, perceptions look rather different, okay? I will say those are in the crosstabs that we post to the internet, so anybody can look at them. But I would strongly urge nobody to interpret a crosstab that's got less than 100 cases in a row of the table.
We're going to wrap our presentation up with a couple of job approval ratings for prominent politicians, Governor Walker and President Obama, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So let's begin with the governor.
Well, things are bad for the governor. 43% approval, 49% disapproval. That's up from 38.59 last month. And this 43 is as high as the 43 we saw in March, which was a recent high. But the 49 is even more striking. It's the first time disapproval has been below 50 since October of 2014. Now, we saw this move up in March, and then it fell right back down in June, July, and early August. But now it has moved back in the governor's favor. If we look at it over the long haul, you can see what a big drop in disapproval there was and a substantial but not quite as large rise in approval. As with all these things, we'll wait and see if it stays with us or if it changes and whether it represents some sort of real shift or just a short-term blip, but it is certainly an improvement in the governor's job approval numbers.
President Obama?
He has fallen off just a little bit to 49.45. He was about 53% approval last time. And again, you can see him over the long haul with a similar kind of movement here at the end, a drop in approval and a rise in disapproval. Still, though, more approval than disapproval, something that has been an advantage to President Obama and perhaps to Democrats down the ballot.
So Charles, let's wrap things up. Your take on this survey. There's been a little movement in certain categories and certain races. What's your takeaway?
Yes, I think there are two things to keep in mind. One is following the conventions, we knew that we were seeing a convention bounce. We saw that in national polling as well. So I think we were at sort of a high water mark in early August. It's not much of a surprise that we would see more competition, closer races after that convention bounce was removed. So I think that much was fairly predictable. And if we look at national polling averages, the Clinton lead in early August was around plus 8 points. And now it's about plus 5 points in national polling. We were higher than that. We were at plus 10 with registered and plus 15 with likelies. And now we've seen it come down to the closer 5 and the very close 3 on likelies. We've also seen this shift in composition of the sample that's a little more pro-Republican among leaners, but not noticeably more pro-Republican in long-term, stronger partisanship. But we see across almost every measure of Clinton, her favorability, her traits, comfort with her, that there's been some drop-off since early in the month. What does that lead us to expect in the long run, I think is an interesting question. One thing to pay attention to is how much Donald Trump has been able to dominate the news cycles, as he did during much of the primary season, and how much that alone prevents the Clinton message from dominating news cycles. We don't have direct measures of the impact of that. It'll be interesting as we now finally are going to get past Labor Day and our 16-month-long journey since the primary season sort of began, finally gets down to those last 2 months of the traditional campaign season, to see how much we see parity in news coverage and attention to Clinton and to Trump versus how much a Trump dominance. I think we're all pretty confident about what the lead tonight on the news is going to be. I expect it's going to be a guy flies to Mexico City.
Something like that.
Something like that.
Let's take a few questions before we wrap things up. Anybody over here on the right side? Go down here first, yes.
How successful are you in getting the geography of your poll respondents to match the
Sure.
population centers in the state of Wisconsin?
Sure. We divide the sample into 5 geographic regions: the city of Milwaukee, the rest of the Milwaukee media market, which is another several counties. It's not just the immediate counties, from Kenosha up to up 3 tiers of counties. We are within a percentage point or 2 in the raw counts for those, and then we weight the data to match those media markets for population. So in the weighted sample, we're matching the geographic distribution of registered voters very closely, almost precisely. But even in the raw sample, we're quite close on all.
Are you not bothering with Eau Claire and Wausau and?
No, of course we are.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, all the markets. So Milwaukee City, rest of the Milwaukee media market, the Madison media market, Green Bay and Appleton. Okay, Green Bay is about 22%, Madison's about 19%. The city of Milwaukee is just under 10, and the rest of the market's just about 30. And then the whole rest of the state, which is La Crosse, Eau Claire, the Twin Cities market, Duluth, Superior, and Wausau, makes up about 24 or so percent. So we're matching those almost exactly every time.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
On the question about the future, whether it will be better or worse, was that just a general question, or was it aimed at economics?
No, it was a very general question. It said, do you think the next generation of Americans will have a future that is better, the same, or worse than life today? I think this is actually a really interesting question to delve into, because there's also a retrospective version. Do you think life today is better, the same, or worse than it was 50 years ago? We actually didn't ask that question because people's personal experiences differ over the last 50 years, right? I have a lot of 50-year experience, my daughter, not so much. And so I took the future-oriented one, which has been the more politically prominent one. But I think it'd be really interesting to delve into, what about health and longevity? By all matter, those are better. Real income has been stagnant recently, but it's certainly better than it was in the 50s or 60s. You know, there's a host of things that sort of objectively say we're doing better, but the sense that we're not doing better is prominent, and certainly the pessimism for the future. So I take it as a challenge to come up with good questions to tease those things out, but I think it's an important issue if you just think of it as economic, or think of it as social, or think of it as some other issue.
Let's take some more questions. Yes, and then I'll go back up there. Yes.
It's been said that presidential candidates can have a coattail impact on other candidates down the ballot. is that something that can be measured in a poll like this, or is that something that only occurs on election day when a voter has a ballot in hand?
You can follow the correlation between how many people are splitting their ticket between presidential and Senate here. That's something that we look at from time to time. I didn't look at it in this particular case. So, it varies, of course, as we go through the election. If you look back into the 80s or 90s, there was more split ticket voting that we can see, both at that individual ticket splitting level, and also in terms of, counties that one party won the presidency and the other party won the Senate, for example. Those split ticket outcomes do seem to have reduced quite a bit following 2000. So will they reopen this time or not is an open question. And are we at a point where the presidential ticket could really affect the down ballot because of people not splitting their ticket? But the other side is the turnout effect. And is it possible that turnout might go down because one party's less enamored of their candidate? I think what we're seeing is Republicans were notably less enamored of Trump earlier. They're still, by this latest measure, about 9 points less likely to vote for him, or 8 points less likely to vote for him than Democrats to vote for Clinton. But it's not an enormous gap anymore, and it seems to be tightening a little bit. So we'll watch it as we get closer to the election, but then election day is the ultimate test, because that's when it actually counts when you walk in and, I want to say pull the lever, but I guess nobody pulls the lever. Yes.
Okay, I'm just wondering, how long have you been asking the question about perceptions of what life is going to be in the future? And then, based on how long you've been asking, have you seen almost a causal effect of the ramping up of the presidential election and primary season and watching it change a bit?
Right. That's a great question. This is the first time we've asked the question, so I have an easy answer. I don't know. I haven't asked it before. But it has been asked on some national surveys before, and it'd be worth it to go back and look and see. Because we do see in other questions evidence that this year's presidential campaign has shifted opinion. The best example of that is preferences about free trade, where up until through 2014, Republicans were more likely to say they favored free trade and thought it was good for the country, and Democrats slightly less likely to say that. But beginning in 2015, as this campaign ramped up, those opinions and positions have reversed, so that ironically now Republicans are the anti-free trade party and Democrats more the pro-free trade party. And we see that in our national data, but we also see it in the Wisconsin data, except our time series doesn't go back as far in time. So that's to shift their beliefs about something over the course of the campaign. But I don't know about the optimism about the future question.
I'm going to wrap things up. Before we go, since this is our first event of the fall semester, I do want to take just a moment to let people in the room know that we'll be doing a number of conversations throughout the fall that will look at this election cycle. Charles will be back on a number of occasions to bring us the latest poll results of the Marquette Law School Poll. We will be hosting a 90-minute debate between U.S. Senator Ron Johnson and the challenger, former Senator Feingold. That will be in October. Here, in this very room, probably right about here. And we have other guests, for example, on September 14th, Catherine Kramer, who's a professor over at UW-Madison. She's written a pretty interesting book about the politics of resentment, as she calls it. It's based on hundreds of interviews she did around the state of Wisconsin. So we have these kinds of events sprinkled in throughout the year. We're kicking things off really next week with a big conference on water issues in this state. We'll have a full house for that. And we'll also have a full house for our first On the Issues Conversation series event, which is Dean Strang, for folks who watched Making a Murderer and who didn't watch Making a Murderer, I guess. He is one of the former attorneys for Stephen Avery, and he will be here to talk about the case and about the justice system. So we have a very full fall. We encourage you to join us. Great to see some of the students in the audience. We hope you'll come back. And Charles, again, thank you for everything. Thank you.